Stranger Things by Mildred Cram. We were seated in the saloon of a small steamer which plies between Naples and Trieste on irregular schedule. Outside, the night was thickly black, and a driving rain swept down the narrow decks. "You Englishmen laugh at ghosts," the Corsican merchant said. "In my country we are less pretentious. Frankly, we are afraid. You too are afraid. And so you laugh. A difference, it seems to me, which lies not in the essence, but in the manner." Dr. Fenton smiled queerly. "Perhaps. What do any of us know about it, one way or the other? Ticklish business. We poke a little too far beyond our ken and get a shock that withers our souls. Cosmic force. We stumble forward, bleating for comfort, and fall over a charged cable. It may have been put there to hold us out or in." Aldobrandini, the Italian inventor, was playing cards with a German engineer. He lost the game to his opponent, and turning about in his chair, came into the conversation. "You are talking about ghosts. I have seen them. Once in the Carso, again in the Campania near Rome. I met a company of Caesar's legionaries tramping through a bed of asphodels. The asphodels lay down beneath those crushing sandals, and then stood upright again, unharmed." The engineer shuffled the cards between short, capable fingers. "Ghosts? Yes, I agree. There are such things, created out of our subconscious selves, mirages of the mind, photographic spiritual projections, hereditary memories. There are always explanations." Dr. Fenton poked into the bowl of his pipe with a broad thumb. "Did any of you happen to know the English poet Cecil Grimshaw? No? I'll tell you a story about him, if you care to listen. A long story, I warn you. Very curious, very suggestive. I cannot vouch for the entire truth of it, since I got the tale from many sources. A word here, a chance encounter there, and at last only the puzzling reports of men who saw Grimshaw out in Africa. He wasn't a friend of mine, or I wouldn't tell these things." Aldobrandini's dark eyes softened. He leaned forward. "Cecil Grimshaw? We Latins admire his work more than any modern Englishman." The doctor tipped his head back against the worn red velvet of the lounge. An oil lamp, swinging from the ceiling, seemed to isolate him in a pool of light. Outside, the invisible sea raced astern, hissing slightly beneath the driving impact of the rain. "I first heard of Grimshaw," the doctor began, "in my student days in London. He was perhaps 5 years my senior, just beginning to be famous. Not yet infamous, but indiscreet enough to get himself talked about. He had written a little book of verse, Vision of Helen, he called it, I believe. The oblique stare of hostile Trojans, Helen coified with flame, Menelaus' love. Greater men than Grimshaw had written of Priam's tragedy. His audacity called attention to his imperfect, colorful verse, his love of beauty, his sense of the exotic, the strange, the unhealthy. People read his book on the sly, and talked about it in whispers. It was indecent, but it was beautiful. At that time, you spoke of Cecil Grimshaw with disapproval, if you spoke of him at all, or if you happened to be a prophet, you saw in him the ultimate bomb beneath the Victorian literary edifice. And so he was. I saw him once at the Alhambra. Poetry in a top hat. He wore evening clothes that were a little too elaborate. A white camellia in his buttonhole, and a thick lensed monocle on a black ribbon. During the entree, he stood up and surveyed the house from pit to gallery, as if he wanted to be seen. He was very tall and the ugliest man in England. Imagine the body of a Lincoln, the hands of a woman, the jaw and mouth of Disraeli, an aristocratic nose, unpleasant eyes, and then that shock of yellow hair, hyacinthine, the curly locks of an insane virtuoso, or a baby prodigy. "Who's that?" I demanded. "Grimshaw, the chap who wrote the book about Naughty Helen, La Belle Helene and the Shepherd Boy." I stared. Everyone else stared. The pit stopped shuffling and giggling to gaze at that prodigious monstrosity, and people in the boxes turned their glasses on him. Grimshaw seemed to be enjoying it. He spoke to someone across the aisle and smiled, showing a set of huge white teeth, veritable tombstones. "Abominable," I said, but I got his book and read it. He was the first Englishman to dare break away from literary conventions. Of course, he shocked England. He was a savage aesthete. I read the slim volume through at one sitting. I was horrified and fascinated. I met Grimshaw a year later. He was having a play produced at the Lyceum, The Labyrinth, with Esther Levinson as Simonetta. She entertained for him at her house in Chelsea, and I got myself invited because I wanted to see the atrocious genius at close range. He wore a lemon-colored vest and a lemon-yellow spats. "How do you do?" he said, gazing at me out of those queer eyes of his. "I hear that you admire my work." "You have been misinformed," I replied. "Your work interests me because I am a student of nervous and mental diseases." "Ah, psychotherapy." "All of the characters in your poem, The Vision of Helen, are neurotics. They suffer from morbid fears, delusions, hysteria, violent mental and emotional complexities. A textbook in madness." Grimshaw laughed. "You flatter me. I'm attracted by neurotic types. Insanity has its source in the unconscious, and we English are afraid of looking inward." He glanced around the room with an amused and cynical look. "Most of these people are as bad as my Trojans, Dr. Fenton, only they conceal their badness, and it isn't good for them." We talked for a few moments. I amused him, I think, by my diagnosis of his Helen's mental malady. But he soon tired of me, and his restless gaze went over my head, searching for admiration. Esther Levinson brought Ellen Terry over, and he forgot me entirely in sparkling for the good lady, showing his teeth, shaking his yellow locks, bellowing like a centaur. The fellow is an ass, I decided. But when the labyrinth was produced, I changed my mind. There again was that disturbing loveliness. It was a story of the passionate Florence of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and Esther Levinson drifted through the 4 long acts against a background of Tuscan walls, scarlet hangings, oaths, blood spilling, dark and terrible vengeance. Grimshaw took London by the throat and put it down on its knees. Then for a year or two he lived on his laurels, lapping up admiration like a drunkard in his cups. Unquestionably, Esther Levinson was his mistress, since she presided over his house in Cheyne Walk. They say she was not the only string to his lute. A Jewess, a Greek poetess, and a dancer from Stockholm made up his amorous medley at that time. Scandalized society flocked to his drawing room, there to be received by the Simonetta herself, wearing the blanched draperies and tragic pearls of his labyrinth he had made for her. Grimshaw offered no apologies. He was the uncrowned laureate, and kings can do no wrong. He was painted by the young sergeant, of course, and by the aging Whistler. You remember the butterfly portrait of him in a yellow kimono leaning against a black mantle? I, for one, think he was vastly amused by all this fury of admiration. He despised it and fed upon it. If he had been less great, he would have been utterly destroyed by it. Even then, I went to Vienna and lost track of him for several years. Then I heard that he had married a dear friend of mine, Lady Dagmar Cooper, one of the greatest beauties and perhaps the sternest prude in England. She wrote me soon after that unbelievable mating. I have married Cecil Grimshaw. I know you won't approve. I do not altogether approve myself. He is not like the men I have known, not at all English. But he intrigues me. There is a sense of power behind his awfulness. You see, I know he is awful. I think I will be able to make him look at things, I mean visible, material things, my way. We have taken a house in town and he has promised to behave. No more Chelsea parties, no dancers, no yellow waistcoats and chrysanthemums. That was all very well for his student days. Now that he is a personage, it will scarcely do. I am tremendously interested and happy. Interested and happy. She was a typical product of Victoria's reign, a beautiful creature whose faith was pinned to the most unimportant things: class, position, a snobbish religion, a traditional morality, and her own place in an intricate little world of ladies and gentlemen. God save us! What was Cecil Grimshaw going to do in an atmosphere of titled beaux, bishops, military men, and cautious statesmen? I could fancy him in his new town house, struggling through some endless dinner party, his cynical, stone-grey eyes sweeping up and down the table, his lips curled in that habitual sneer, his mind perhaps gone back to the red and blue room in Chelsea, where he had been wont to stand astride before the black mantle, bellowing indecencies into the ears of witty modernists. Could he bellow any longer? Apparently not. I heard of him now and then from this friend and that. He was indeed behaving well. He wrote nothing to shock the sensibilities of his wife's world, a few fantastic short stories touched with a certain childish spirituality, and that was all. They say he bent his manners to hers, a tamed centaur grazing with a milk-white doe. He grew a trifle fat, quite like a model English husband. He called Dagmar "my dear," and drove with her in the park at the fashionable hour, his hands crossed on the head of his cane, his eyes half closed. She wrote me, "I'm completely happy. So is Cecil. Surely he can have made no mistake in marrying me." You all know that this affectation of respectability did not last long, not more than 5 years, long enough for the novelty to wear off. The genius or the devil that was in Cecil Grimshaw made its reappearance. He was tossed out of Dagmar's circle like a burning rock hurled from the mouth of a crater. He fell into Chelsea again. Esther Levinson had come back from the States and was casting about for a play. She sought out Grimshaw, and with her presence, her grace and pallor and seduction lured him into his old ways. "The leaves are yellow," he said to her, "but still they dance in a south wind. The altar fires are ash, and grass has grown upon the temple floor. I have been away too long. Get me a pipe, you laughing dryad, and I'll play for you." He played for her, and all England heard. Dagmar heard and pretended acquiescence. According to her lights, she was magnificent. She invited Esther Levinson to Broadenham, the Grimshaw place in Kent, nor did she wince when the actress accepted. When I got back to England, Dagmar was fighting for her soul with all the weapons she had. I went to see her in her cool little town house, that house so typical of her, so untouched by Grimshaw, and looking at me with steady eyes, she said, "I'm sorry Cecil isn't here. He is writing again, a play for Esther Levinson, who was Simonetta, you remember? I promised you a ghost story. If it is slow in coming, it is because all these things have a bearing on the mysterious, the extraordinary things that happened. You probably knew about the last phase of Grimshaw's career. Who doesn't? There is something fascinating about the escapades of a famous man. But when he happens also to be a great poet, we cannot forget his very human sins. In them, he is akin to us. Not all you have heard and read about Grimshaw's career is true, but the best you can say of him is bad enough. He squandered his own fortune first on Esther Levinson and the production of The Sunken City, and then stole ruthlessly from Dagmar, that is, until she found legal ways to put a stop to it. We had passed into Edward's reign, and the decadence which ended the war had already set in. Grimshaw was the last of the Pomegranate School, the first of the bolder, more sinister futurists, a frank hedonist, an intellectual voluptuary. He set the pace, and a whole tribe of idolaters and imitators panted at his heels. They copied his yellow waistcoats, his chrysanthemums, his eyeglass, his bellow. Nice young men, otherwise sane, let the hair grow long like the idols, and profess themselves unbelievers. Unbelievers in what? God save us. 10 years later, most of them were wading through the mud of Flanders, believing something pretty definite. One night, I was called to the telephone by the Grimshaw's physician. I'll tell you his name, because he has a lot to do with the rest of the story. Dr. Warham, Douglas Warham, an Australian. Grimshaw has murdered a man, he said briefly. I want you to help me. Come to Cheyne Walk. Take a cab. Hurry. Of course I went, with a very clear vision of the future of Dagmar, Lady Cooper, to occupy my thoughts during that lurching drive through the slippery streets. I knew that she was at Broadenham, holding up her head in seclusion. Grimshaw's house was one of a row of red brick buildings not far from the river. Dr. Warham himself opened the door to me. I say, this is an awful mess, he said, in a shocked voice. The woman sent for me, Levinson, the actress. There's some mystery, a dead man, his head knocked in, and Grimshaw's sound asleep. It may be hysterical, but I can't wake him. Have a look before I get the police. I followed him into the studio, the famous Pompeian room on the second floor. I shall never forget the frozen immobility of the three actors in the tragedy. Esther Levinson, wrapped in peacock blue scarves, stood upright before the black mantle, her hands crossed on her breast. Cecil Grimshaw was lying full length on a brick red satin couch, his head thrown back, his eyes closed. The dead man sprawled on the floor, face down between them. Two lamps made of sapphire glass swung from the gilded ceiling. Bowls of perfumed waxen flowers, a silver statuette of a nude girl, a tessellated floor strewn with rugs, orange trees in shrubs, cigarette smoke hanging motionless in the still, overheated air. I stooped over the dead man. Who is he? Tucker, leading man in the sunken city. Look at Grimshaw, will you? We mustn't be too long. I went to the poet. The inevitable monocle was still caught and held by the yellow thatch of his thick brow. He was breathing slowly. Grimshaw, I said, touching his forehead, open your eyes. He did so, and I was startled by the expression of despair in their depths. Ah, he said, it's the psychopathologist. How did this happen? He sat up. I'm convinced that he had been faking that drunken sleep, and stared at the sprawling figure on the floor. Tucker quarreled with me, he said. I knocked him down and his forehead stuck against the table. Then he crawled over here and died. From fright, do you think? He shuddered. Take him away, Warham, will you? I've got work to do. Suddenly, Esther Levinson spoke in a flat voice, without emotion. It isn't true. He stuck him with that silver statuette, like this. She made a violent gesture with both arms. And before God in heaven, I'll make him pay for it. I will. Keep still, I said sharply. Grimshaw looked up at her. He made a gesture of surrender. Then he smiled. Simonetta, he said, you're no better than the rest. She sobbed, ran over to him, and went down on her knees, twisting her arms about his waist. There was a look of distaste in Grimshaw's eyes. He stared into her distraught face a moment. Then he freed himself from her arms and got to his feet. I think I'll telephone to Dagmar, he said. But Warham shook his head. I'll do that. I'm sorry, Grimshaw. The police will have to know. While we're waiting for them, you might write a letter to Mrs. Grimshaw. I'll see that she gets it in the morning. I don't remember whether the poet wrote to Dagmar then or not. But surely you remember how she stayed by him during the trial, still Victorian, in her black gown and veil, mourning for the hope that was dead, at least. You remember his imprisonment, the bitter invective of his enemies, the defection of his followers, the dark scandals that filled the newspapers, offended public taste, and destroyed Cecil Grimshaw's popularity in an England that had worshipped him. Esther Levinson lied to save him. That was the strangest thing of all. She denied what she had told us that night of the tragedy. Tucker, she said, had been in love with her. He followed her to Grimshaw's house in Chelsea and quarreled violently with the poet. His death was an accident. Grimshaw had not touched the statuette. When he saw what had happened, he telephoned to Dr. Warren and then lay down on the couch, apparently fainted there, for he did not speak until Dr. Fenton came. Warren perjured himself too, for Dagmar's sake. He had not, he swore, heard the actress speak of a silver statuette or of revenge before God. And since there was nothing to prove how the blow had been struck, save the deep dent in Tucker's forehead, Grimshaw was set free. He had been a year in prison. He drove away from the jail in a cab with Dr. Warren, and when the crowd saw that he was wearing the old symbol, a yellow chrysanthemum, a hiss went up that was like a geyser of contempt and ridicule. Grimshaw's pallid face flushed, but he lifted his hat and smiled into the host of faces as the cab jerked forward. He went at once to Broadenham. Years later, Warren told me about the meeting between those two, the centaur and the milk-white doe. Dagmar received him standing, and she remained standing all during the interview. She had put aside her mourning for a dress made of some clear blue stuff, and Warren said, as she stood in the breakfast room with a sun-flooded window behind her, she was very lovely indeed. Grimshaw held out his hands, but she ignored them. Then Grimshaw smiled and shrugged his shoulders and said, I have made 2 discoveries this past year. That conventionalized religion is the most shocking evil of our day, and that you, my wife, are in love with Dr. Warren. Dagmar held her ground. There was in her eyes a look of inevitable security. She was mistress of the house, proprietor of the land, conscious of tradition, prerogative, position. The man she faced had nothing except his tortured imagination. For the first time in her life, she was in a position to hurt him. So she looked away from him to Warren and confirmed his discovery with a smile full of pride and happiness. My dear fellow, Grimshaw shouted, clapping Warren on the back. I am confoundedly pleased. We'll arrange a divorce for Dagmar. Good heavens, she deserves a decent future. I'm not the sort for her. I hate the things she cares most about. And now I'm done for in England. Just to make it look conventional, nice, Victorian, English, you understand? You and I can go off to the continent together while Dagmar's getting rid of me. There'll be no trouble about that. I'm properly dished. Besides, I want freedom, a new life, beauty, without having to buck this confounded distress of beauty. Sensation, without being ashamed of sensation. I want to drop out of sight. Reform? No. I'm being honest. So they went off together, as friendly as you please, to France. Warren was still thinking of Dagmar. Grimshaw was thinking only of himself. He swaggered up and down the Paris boulevards, showing his tombstone teeth and staring at the women. The Europeans admire me, he said to Warren. May England go to the devil, he groaned. I despise respectability, my dear Warren. You and Dagmar are well rid of me. I see I am offending you here in Paris. You look nauseated most of the time. Let's go on to Switzerland and climb mountains. Warren was nauseated. They went to Salvan, and there a curious thing happened. They were walking one afternoon along the road to Martigny. The valley was full of shadows like a deep green cup of purple wine. High above them the mountains were tipped with flame. Grimshaw walked slowly, He was a man of great physical laziness, slashing his cane at the tassel tips of crowding larches. Once, when a herd of little goats trotted by, he stood aside and laughed uproariously, and the goatherd's dog, bristling, snapped in passing at his legs. They were walking one afternoon along the road to Martigny. Warren was silent, full of bitterness and disgust. They went on again, and well down the spring-like coils of the descent of Martigny, they came upon the body of a man, one of those wandering vendors of pocket knives and key rings, scissors and cheap watches. He lay on his back on a low bank by the roadside. His hat had rolled off into a pool of muddy water. Dr. Warren saw, as he bent down to stare at the face, that the fellow looked like Grimshaw. Not exactly, of course. The nose was coarser. It had not that Wellington spring at the bridge, nor the curved nostrils, but it might have been a dirty, unshaven, dead Grimshaw lying there. Warren told me that he felt a shock of gratification before he heard the poet's voice behind him. "What's this? A drunkard?" He shook his head and opened the dead man's shirt to feel for any possible flutter of life in the heart. There was none, and he thought, if this were only Grimshaw, if the whole miserable business were only done with. "By Jove," Grimshaw said, "the chap looks like me. I thought I was the ugliest man in the world. I know better. Do you suppose he's German or Lombardian? His hands are warm. He must have been alive when the goatherd passed just now. Nothing you can do?" Warren stayed where he was, on his knees. He tore his eyes away from the grotesque dead face and fixed them on Grimshaw. He told me that the force of his desire must have spoken in that look, because Grimshaw started and stepped back a pace, gripping his cane. Then he laughed. "Why not?" he said. "Let this be me, and I'll go on with that clanking hardware store around my neck. It can be done, can't it? Better for you and for Dagmar. I'm not being philanthropic. I'm looking not for a reprieve, but for release. No one knows this fellow in Salvan. He probably came up from the Rhone and was on his way to Chamonix. What do you think was the matter with him?" "Heart," Dr. Warren answered. "Well, what do you say? This peddler and I are social outcasts. And there is Dagmar in England, weeping her eyes out because of divorce courts and more public washing of dirty linen. You love her. I don't. Why not carry this fellow to the Ohoshi tonight after dark? Tomorrow, when I have changed clothes with him, we can throw him into the valley. It's a good 1,000 feet or more. Would there be much left of that face for purposes of identification? I think not. You can take the mutilated body back to England. I can go on to Chamonix, as he would have gone." Grimshaw touched the peddler with his foot. "Pray." That is exactly what they did. The body, hidden near the roadside until nightfall, was carried through the woods to the Ohoshi d'Issoire, that little plateau on the brink of the tremendous wall of rock which rises from the Rhone Valley to the heights near Salvan. There the two men left it and returned to their hotel to sleep. In the morning they set out, taking care that the proprietor of the hotel and the professional guide who hung about the village should know that they were going to attempt the descent of the wall to the valley. The proprietor shook his head and said, "Bonne chance, messieurs." The guide, letting his small blue eyes rest for a moment on Grimshaw's slow-moving hulk, advised them gravely to take the road. "The tall gentleman will not arrive," he remarked. "Nonsense," Grimshaw answered. They went off together, laughing. Grimshaw was wearing his conspicuous climbing clothes: tweed jacket, yellow suede waistcoat, knickerbockers, and high-laced boots with hobnailed soles. His green felt hat, tipped at an angle, was ornamented with a little orange feather. He was in tremendous spirits. He bellowed, made faces at scared peasant children in the village, swung a stick. They stopped at a barber shop in the place, and those famous hyacinthine locks were clipped. Borum insisted upon this, he told me, because the peddler's hair was fairly short, and they had to establish some sort of tonsorial alibi. When the floor of the little shop was thick with the sheared petals, Grimshaw shook his head, brushed off his shoulders, and smiled. It took 20 years to create that visible personality, and behold, a Swiss barber destroys it in 20 minutes. I'm no longer a living poet. I'm already an immortal, halfway up the flowery slopes of Olympus, impatient to go the rest of the way. Shall we be off? By all means, Warham said. They found the body where they had hidden it the night before, and in the shelter of a little grove of larches. Grimshaw stripped and then reclothed himself in the peddler's coarse and soiled underlinen, the worn corduroy trousers, the flannel shirt, short coat, and old black velvet hat. Warham was astounded by the beauty and strength of Grimshaw's body. Like the peddler, he was blonde-skinned, thin-waisted, broad of back. Grimshaw shuddered as he helped to clothe the dead peddler in his own fashionable garments. Death, he said. Ugh, how ugly, how terrifying, how abominable. They carried the body across the plateau. The height where they stood was touched by the sun, but the valley below was still immersed in shadow, a broad purple shadow threaded by the shining Rhone. Well, Warham demanded, are you eager to die? For this means death for you, you know. A living death, Grimshaw said. He glanced down at the replica of himself. A convulsive shudder passed through him from head to foot. His face twisted, his eyes dilated. He made a strong effort to control himself and whispered, I understand. Go ahead. Do it. I can't. It's like destroying me, myself. I can't. Do it. Warham lifted the dead body and pushed it over the edge. Grimshaw, trembling violently, watched it fall. I think, from what Dr. Warham told me many years later, that the poet must have suffered the violence and terror of that plummet drop, must have felt the tearing clutch of pointed rocks in the wall face, must have known the leaping upward of the earth, the whine wind in his bursting ears, the dizzy spinning, the rendering, obliterating impact at last. The peddler lay in the valley. Grimshaw stood on the brink of the wall. He turned and saw Dr. Warham walking quickly away across the plateau without a backward glance. They had agreed that Warham was to return at once to the village and report the death of his friend Mr. Grimshaw. The body, they knew, would be crushed beyond recognition, a bruised and broken fragment, like enough to Cecil Grimshaw to pass whatever examination would be given it. Grimshaw himself was to go through the wood to the high road, then on to Finhaut and Chamonix and into France. He was never again to write to Dagmar, to return to England, or to claim his English property. Can you imagine his feelings? Deprived of his arrogant personality, his fame, his very identity, clothed in another man's dirty garments, wearing about his neck a clattering peddler's outfit, upon his feet the clumsy boots of a peasant, Grimshaw, the exquisite futurist, the daffodil, apostle of the aesthetic. He stood there for a moment looking after Douglas Warham. Once, in a panic, he called, but Warham disappeared between the larches without apparently having heard. Grimshaw wavered, unable to decide upon the way to the high road. He could not shake off a sense of loneliness and terror, as if he himself had gone whirling down to his death. Like a man who comes slowly back from the effects of ether, he perceived one by one the familiar aspects of the landscape, the delicate flowers powdering the plateau, the tasseled larches on the slope, the lofty snow peaks still suffused with rosy morning light. This, then, was the world. This clumsy being moving slowly toward the forest was himself. Not Cecil Grimshaw, but another man. His mind sought clumsily for a name. Pierre. No, not Pierre. Too commonplace. Was he still fastidious? No. Then Pierre. By all means. Pierre Pillow. That would do. Pillow. A name suggestive of a good, amiable fellow, honest and slow. When he got down into France, he would change his identity again, grow a beard, buy some decent clothes. A boulevardier, gay, perverse, witty. The thought delighted him, and he hurried through the forest, anxious to pass through Salvan before Dr. Warham got there. He felt extraordinarily light and exhilarated now, intoxicated, vibrant. His spirit soared. Almost he heard the rushing of his old self forward towards some unrecognizable and beautiful freedom. When he struck the road, the sun was high and it was very hot. Little spirals of dust kicked up at his heels. He was not afraid of recognition. Happening to glance at his hands, he became aware of their whiteness and, stooping, rubbed them in the dust. Then a strange thing happened. Another herd of goats trotted down from the grassy slopes and spilled into the roadway. And another dog with the lolling tongue and wagging tail wove in and out, shepherding the little beasts. They eddied about Grimshaw, brushing against him, their moonstone eyes full of a vague terror of that barking guardian at their heels. The dog drove them ahead, circled, and with a low whine came back to Grimshaw, leaping up to lick his hand. Grimshaw winced, for he had never had success with animals. Then, with a sudden change of mood, he stooped and caressed the dog's head. "A good fellow," he said in French to the goatherd. The goatherd looked at him curiously. "Not always," he answered. "He is an unpleasant beast with most strangers. For you, he seems to have taken a fancy. What have you got there? Any two-bladed knives?" Grimshaw started and recovered himself with, "Knives? Yes, all sorts." The goatherd fingered his collection, trying the blades on his broad thumb. "You come from France?" he said. Grimshaw nodded. "From Lyon." "I thought so. You speak French like a gentleman." Grimshaw shrugged. "This is usual in Lyon." The peasant paid for the knife he fancied, placing 2 francs in the poet's palm. Then he whistled to the dog and set off after his flock. But the dog, whining and trembling, followed Grimshaw and would not be shaken off until Grimshaw had pelted him with small stones. I think the poet was strangely flattered by this encounter. He passed through Salvan with his head in the air, challenging recognition. But there was no recognition. The guide who had said, "The tall monsieur will not arrive," now greeted him with a fraternal, "How is trade?" "Very good, thanks," Grimshaw said. Beyond the village, He quickened his pace, and easing the load on his back by putting his hands under the leather straps, he swung toward Finhout. Behind him, he heard the faint ringing of the church bells in Salvan. Warham had reported the tragedy. Grimshaw could fancy the excitement. The priest hurrying toward the wall with his crucifix in his hands. The barber aquiver with morbid excitement. The stolid guide, not at all surprised, rather gratified, preparing to make the descent to recover the body of the tall monsieur who had, after all, arrived. The telegraph wires were already humming with the message. In a few hours, Dagmar would know. He laughed aloud. The whole road spun beneath him. His hands, pressed against his body by the weight of the leather straps, were hot and wet. He could feel the loud beating of his heart. His senses were acute. He had never before felt with such gratification the warmth of the sun, or known the ecstasy of motion. He saw every flower in the road bank, every small glacial brook, every new conformation of the snow clouds hanging above the ragged peaks of the Argentière. He sniffed with delight the pungent wind from off the glaciers, the short, warm puffs of grass-scented air from the fields in the valley of Trient. He noticed the flight of birds, the lazy swinging of pine boughs, the rainbow spray of waterfalls. Once he shouted and ran, mad with exuberance. Again he flung himself down by the roadside, and lying on his back, sang outrageous songs, and laughed and slapped his breast with both hands. That night he came to Chamonix and got lodging in a small hotel on the skirts of the town. His spirits fell when he entered the room. He put the peddler's pack on the floor and sat down on the narrow bed, suddenly conscious of an enormous fatigue. His feet burned, his legs ached, his back was raw where the heavy pack had rested. He thought, what am I doing here? I've nothing but the few £100 Warham gave me. I'm alone, dead and alive. He scarcely looked up when the door opened and a young girl came in carrying a pitcher of water and a coarse towel. She hesitated and said rather prettily, "You will be tired, perhaps?" Grimshaw felt within him the tug of the old personality. He stared at her, suddenly conscious that she was a woman, and that she was smiling at him, charming in her way, bare arms, a little black bodice laced over a white waist, straight blonde hair, braided thickly and twisted around her head. A peasant, but pretty. You see, his desire was to frighten her, as he most certainly would have frightened her had he been true to Cecil Grimshaw. But the impulse passed, leaving him sick and ashamed. He heard her saying, "A sad thing occurred today down the valley. A gentleman, Salvan, a very famous gentleman, and they have telegraphed his wife. I heard it from Simon Ravel. It seems that the gentleman was smashed to bits. Barissa, monsieur. Épouvantable, n'est-ce pas?" Grimshaw began to tremble. Yes, he said irritably. "But I'm tired. Little one, go out and shut the door." The girl gave him a startled glance, frightened at last, but for nothing more than the last look in his eyes. He raised his arms, and she fled with a little scream. Grimshaw sat for a moment, staring at the door. Then, with a violent gesture, he threw himself back on the bed, buried his face in the dirty pillow, and wept as a child weeps, until, just before dawn, he fell asleep. As far as the public knows, Cecil Grimshaw perished on the wall, perished and was buried at Broadenham beneath the pyramid of chrysanthemums, perished and became an English immortal, his sins erased by his unconscious sacrifice, perished and was forgiven by Dagmar. Yet hers was the victory. He belonged to her at last. She had not buried his body at Broadenham, but she had buried his work there. He could never write again. During those days of posthumous whitewashing, he read the papers with a certain contemptuous eagerness. Some of them he crumpled between his hands and threw away. He hated his own image staring balefully from the first page of the illustrated reviews. He despised England for honoring him. Once, happening upon a volume of The Vision of Helen, the first edition illustrated by Beardsley, in a bookstall at Aix-les-Bains, he read it from cover to cover. "Poor stuff," he said to the bookseller, tossing it down again. "Give me Arsène Lupin." And he paid 2 sous for a paper-covered, dog-eared, much-thumbed copy of the famous detective story, not because he intended to read it, but in payment for his hour of disillusionment. Then he slung his pack over his shoulders and tramped out into the country. He laughed aloud at the thought of Helen and her idolaters. A poetic hoax. Overripe words, seductive sounds. Nonsense. Surely I can do better than that today, he thought. He saw 2 children working in a field and called to them. "If you will give me a cup of cold water," he said, "I'll tell you a story." "Gladly, monsieur." The boy put down his spade, went to a brook which threaded the field, and came back with an earthenware jug full to the brim. The little girl stared gravely at Grimshaw while he drank. Grimshaw wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "What story shall it be?" he demanded. The little girl said quickly, "The Black King and the White Princess and the beast who lived in the wood." "Not that one," the boy cried. "Tell us about a battle." "I will sing about life," Grimshaw said. It was hot in the field. A warm, sweet smell rose from the spaded earth, and nearby the brook rustled through the grass like a beautiful silver serpent. Grimshaw sat cross-legged on the ground, and words spun from his lips, simple words, and he sang of things he had recently learned, the gaiety of birds, the strength of his arms, the scent of dusk, the fine crystal of a young moon, wind in a field of wheat. At first the children listened. Then, because he talked so long, the little girl leaned slowly over against his shoulder and fell asleep, while the boy fingered the knives, jangled the key rings, clipped grass stalks with the scissors, and wound the watches one after the other. The sun was low before Grimshaw left them. "When you're grown up," he said, "remember that Pierre Pilleux sang to you of life." "Oui, monsieur," the boy said politely. "But I should like a watch." Grimshaw shook his head. "The song is enough." Thereafter he sang to anyone who would listen to him. I say that he sang. I mean, of course, that he spoke his verses. It was a minstrel's simple improvisation. But there are people in the villages of southern France who still recall that ungainly, shambling figure. He had grown a beard. It crinkled thickly, hiding his mouth and chin. He laughed a great deal. He was not altogether clean, and he slept wherever he could find a bed, in farmhouses, cheap hotels, hay lofts, stables, open fields. Warham's few £100 were gone. The poet lived by his wits and his gift of song, and for the first time in his remembrance he was happy. Then one day he read in Lumeta that Ada Rubinstein was to play The Labyrinth in Paris. Grimshaw was in Poitiers. He borrowed 300 francs from the proprietor of a small cafe in the Rue Carnot, left his pack as security, and went to Paris. Can you imagine him in the theatre? It was the Odeon, I believe, conscious, curious, amused glances. A peasant, bulking conspicuously in that scented auditorium. When the curtain rose, he felt again the familiar pain of creation. A rush of hot blood surged around his heart. His temples throbbed. His eyes filled with tears. Then the flood receded and left him trembling with weakness. He sat through the rest of the performance without emotion of any sort. He felt no resentment, no curiosity. This was the last time he showed any interest in his old existence. He went back to Poitiers and then took to the road again. People who saw him at that time have said that there was always a pack of dogs at his heels. Once, a fashionable spaniel followed him out of Lyons and he was arrested for theft. You understand, he never made any effort to attract the little fellows. They joined on, as it were, for the journey. And it was a queer fact that after a few miles they always whined, as if they were disappointed about something, and turned back. He finally heard that Dagmar had married Worm. She had waited a decent interval, Victorian to the end. A man who happened to be in Marseille at the time told me that vagabond poet, Pilleux, appeared in one of the cafes, roaring drunk, and recited a marriage poem, obscene, vicious, terrific. A crowd came in from the street to listen. Some of them laughed. Others were frightened. He was an ugly brute, well over 6 feet tall, with a blonde beard, a hooked nose, and a pair of eyes that saw beyond reality. He was fascinating. He could turn his eloquence off and on like a tap. He sat in a drunken stupor, glaring at the crowd, until someone shouted, "Eh bien, Pilleux, you were saying?" Then the deluge. He had a peasant's acceptance of the elemental facts of life. It was raw, that hymn of his. The women of the streets, who had crowded into the cafe, listened with a sort of terror. They admired him. One of them said, "Pilleux's wife betrayed him." He lifted his glass and drank. "No, ma petite," he said politely. "She buried me." That night, his pack was stolen from him. He was too drunk to know or to care. They say that he went from cafe to cafe, paying for wine with verse and getting it too. At his heels, a crowd of loafers, frowsy women and dogs. His hat gone. His eyes mad. A trickle of wine through his beard. Bellowing again. The untamed centaur cheated of the dough. And now, perhaps I can get back to the reasons for this story, and I'm almost at the end of it. In the most obscure alley in Marseilles, there is a cafe frequented by sailors, riff-raff from the waterfront, and thieves. Grimshaw appeared there at midnight. A woman clung to his arm. She had no eyes for anyone else. Her name, I believe, was Marie, a very humble Magdalene of that tragic backwater of civilization. Putting a cheek against Grimshaw's arm, she listened to him with a curious patience, as one listens to the eloquence of the sea. "This is no place for thee," he said to her. "Leave me now, ma petite." But she laughed and went with him. Imagine that room, foul air, sanded floor, kerosene lamps, an odor of bad wine, tobacco, and stale humanity. Grimshaw pushed his way to a table and sat down with a surly Gascon and an enormous Negro from some American ship in the harbor. They brought the poet wine, but he did not drink it. Sat staring at the smoky ceiling, assailed by a sudden sharp vision of Dagmar and Warham at Broadenham, alone together for the first time, perhaps on the terrace in the starlight, perhaps in Dagmar's bright room, which had always been scented, warm, remote. He had been reciting, of course, in French. Now he broke abruptly into English. No one but the American Negro understood. The proprietor shouted, "Hi there, Pillio, no gibberish." The woman, her eyes on Grimshaw's face, said warningly, "Shh, he speaks English. He is clever, this poet. Pay attention." And the Negro, startled, jerked his drunken body straight and listened. I don't know what Grimshaw said. It must have been a poem of home, the bitter longing of an exile for familiar things. At any rate, the Negro was touched. He was a Louisianian, a son of New Orleans. He saw the gentleman, where you and I perhaps would have seen only a maudlin savage. There is no other explanation for the thing that happened. "Quiet," Grimshaw said, and her fury receded before his glance. She melted, acquiesced, smiled. Then Grimshaw smiled too, and putting the glass to rights with a leisurely gesture, said, "Cabbage, son of pig," and flipped the dregs into Gascon's face. The fellow groaned and leaped. Grimshaw didn't stir. He was too drunk to protect himself. But the Negro saw what was in the Gascon's hand. He kicked back his chair, stretched out his arms. Too late. The Gascon's knife, intended for Grimshaw, sliced into his heart. He coughed, looked at the man he had saved with a strange questioning, and collapsed. Grimshaw was sobered instantly. They say he broke the Gascon's arm before the crowd could separate them. Then he knelt down by the dying Negro, turned him gently over, and lifted him in his arms, supporting that ugly bullet head against his knee. The Negro coughed again and whispered, "I saw it coming, boss." Grimshaw said simply, "Thank you. I'm scared, boss." "That's all right. I will see you through." "I'm done, boss." "Is it hard?" "Yes, sir." "Hold my hand." "That's right. Nothing to be afraid of." The Negro's eyes fixed themselves on Grimshaw's face. A somber look came into their depths. "I'm going, boss." Grimshaw lifted him again. As he did so, he was conscious of feeling faint and dizzy. The Negro's blood was warm on his hands and wrists, but it was not wholly that. He had a sensation of rushing forward, of pressure against his eardrums, a violent nausea. The crowd of curious faces, blurred, disappeared. He was drowning in a noisy darkness. He gasped, struggled, struck out with his arms, shouted, went down in that suffocating flood of unconsciousness. Opening his eyes after an indeterminate interval, he found himself in the street. The air was cool after the fetid staleness of that room. He was still holding the Negro's hand, and above them the stars burned, remote and calm, like beacon lamps in a dark harbor. The Negro whimpered, "I don't know the way, boss. I'm lost." "Where is your ship?" "You port near the fort." They walked together through the silent streets. I say that they walked. It was rather that Grimshaw found himself on the quay, the Negro still at his side. A few prowling sailors passed them, but for the most part the waterfront was deserted. The ships lay side by side, an intricate tangle of bowsprits and rigging, masts and chains. Around them the water was black as basalt, only that now and again a spark of light was struck by the faint lifting of the current against the immovable hulls. The Negro shuffled forward, peering. A lantern flashed on one of the big schooners. Looking up, Grimshaw saw the name Ann B.B. New Orleans. A querulous voice somewhere on the deck demanded, "That you, Richardson?" And then angrily, "This damn place, dark as hell. Who's there?" Grimshaw answered, "One of your crew." The man on deck stared down at the quay a moment. Then, apparently having seen nothing, he turned away, and the lantern bobbed aft like a drifting ember. The Negro moaned. Holding both hands over the deep wound in his breast, he slowly climbed the side ladder, turned once to look at Grimshaw, and disappeared. Grimshaw felt again the rushing darkness. Again he struggled, and again, opening his eyes after a moment of blankness, he found himself kneeling on the sanded floor of the cafe, holding the dead Negro in his arms. He glanced down at the face, astounded by the look of placid satisfaction in those wide open eyes, the smile of recognition, of gratification, of some nameless and magnificent content. The woman Maury touched his shoulder. "The fellow is dead, monsieur. We had better go." Grimshaw followed her into the street. He noticed that there were no stars. A bitter wind, forerunner of the implacable mistral, had come up. The door of the cafe slammed behind them, muffling a sudden uproar of voices that had burst out with his going. Grimshaw had a room somewhere in the old town. He went there, followed by the woman. He thought, "I'm mad, mad." He was frightened, not by what had happened to him, but because he could not understand. Nor can I make it clear to you, since no explanation is final when we are dealing with the inexplicable. When they reached his room, Maury lighted the kerosene lamp and, smoothing down her black hair with both hands, said simply, "I stay with you." "You must not," Grimshaw answered. "I love you," she said. "You are a great man, Sissa." "That's that. Besides, I must love someone. I mean do for someone." "You think that I like pleasure?" "Ah, perhaps. I'm young, but my heart follows you. I stay here." Grimshaw stared at her without hearing. "I opened the door. I went beyond. I am perhaps mad, perhaps privileged, perhaps what they have always called me, an incorrigible poet." Suddenly he jumped to his feet and shouted, "I went a little way with the soul. Victory! Eternity!" The woman Maury put her hands on his shoulders and pushed him back into his chair again. She thought, of course, that he was drunk. So she attempted a simple seduction, striving to call attention to herself by the coquetries of her kind. Grimshaw pushed her aside and lay down on the bed with his arms crossed over his eyes. Had he witnessed a soul's first uncertain steps into a new state? One thing he knew. He had himself suffered the confusion of death, and had shared the desperate struggle to penetrate the barrier between the mortal and the immortal, the known and the unknown, the real and the incomprehensible. With that realization, he stepped finally out of his personality into that of the mystic philosopher, Pierre Pilleux. He heard the woman Marie saying, "Let me stay, I am unhappy," and without opening his eyes, simply making a brief gesture, he said, "Eh bien," and she stayed. She never left him again. In the years that followed, wherever Grimshaw was, there was also Marie. Little, swarthy, broad of cheek and hip, unimaginative, faithful. She had a passion for service. She cooked for Grimshaw, knitted woolen socks for him, brushed and mended his clothes, watched out for his health. Often, I am convinced, she stole for him. As for Grimshaw, he didn't know that she existed, beyond the fact that she was there and that she made material existence endurable. He never again knew physical love. That I am sure of, for I have talked with Marie. "He was good to me," she said, "but he never loved me." And I believe her. That night of the Negro's death, Grimshaw stood in a wilderness of his own. He emerged from it a believer in life after death. He preached this belief in the slums of Marseille. It began to be said of him that his presence made death easy, that the touch of his hand steadied those who were about to die. Feverish, terrified, reluctant, they became suddenly calm, wistful, and passed quietly as one falls asleep. "Send for Pierre Pilleux" became a familiar phrase in the old town. I do not believe that he could have touched these simple people had he not looked the part of prophet and saint. The old Grimshaw was gone. In his place, an emaciated fanatic, unconscious of appetite, unaware of self, with burning eyes and tangled beard. That finished ugliness turned spiritual. A self-flagellated aesthete, he claimed that he could enter the shadowy confines of the next world, not heaven, not hell, a neutral ground between the familiar earth and an inexplicable territory of the spirit. Here, he said, the dead suffered bewilderment. They remembered, desired, and regretted life they had just left, without understanding what lay ahead. So far he could go with them, so far and no further. Personal immortality is the most alluring hope ever dangled before humanity. All of us secretly desire it. None of us really believe in it. As you say, all of us are afraid, and some of us laugh to hide our fear. Grimshaw wasn't afraid, nor did he laugh. He knew. And you remember his eloquence, seductive words, poignant, delicious, memorable words. In his Chelsea days, he had made you sultry with hate. Now, as Pierre Pilleux, he made you believe in the shining beauty of the indestructible, of the unconquerable dead. You saw them, a host of familiar figures, walking fearlessly away from you toward the brightness of a distant horizon. You heard them murmuring together as they passed out of sight, going forward to share the common and ineffable experience. Well, the pagan had disappeared in the psychic. Cecil Grimshaw's melancholy and pessimism, his love of power, his delight in cruelty, in beauty, in the erotic, the violent, the strange, had vanished. Pierre Pilleux was a humanitarian. Cecil Grimshaw never had been. Grimshaw had revolted against ugliness as a dilettante objects to the mediocre in art. Piepello was conscious of social ugliness. Having become aware of it, he was a potent rebel. He began to write in French, spreading his revolutionary doctrine of facile spiritual reward. He splintered purgatory into fragments. What he offered was an earthly paradise. Humanity given eternal absolution, freed of fear, prejudice, hatred, above all, of fear, and certain of endless life. Now that we have entered the cosmic era, we look back at him with understanding. Then he was a radical and an atheist. Of course, he had followers, seekers after eternity, who drank his promises like thirsty wanderers come upon a spring in the desert. To some of them, he was good. To some, a mystic. To some, a healer. To some, and they were the ones who finally controlled his destiny, he was simply a dangerous lunatic. 2 women in Marseille committed suicide. They were followers, disciples, whatever you choose to call them. At any rate, they believed that where it was so simple a matter to die, it was foolish to stay on in a world that had treated them badly. One had lost a son, the other a lover. One shot herself, the other drowned herself in the canal. And both of them left letters addressed to Pilleux, enough to damn him in the eyes of authority. He was told that he might leave France or take the consequences. A mild enough warning, but it worked. He dare not provoke an inquiry into his past. So he shipped on board a small Mediterranean steamer as fireman and disappeared. No one knew where. 2 years later, he reappeared in Africa. Marie was with him. They were living in a small town on the rim of the desert near Biskra. Grimshaw occupied a native house, a mere hovel, flat-roofed, sun-baked, bare as a hermit's cell. Marie had hired herself out as a femme de chambre in the only hotel in the place. I watched over him, she told me, and believe me, monsieur, he needed care. He was thin as a ghost. He had starved more than once during those 2 years. He told me to go back to France to seek happiness for myself. But for me, happiness was with him. I laughed and stayed. I loved him magnificently, monsieur. Grimshaw was writing again, in French, and his work began to appear in the Parisian journals. A strange, poetic prose, impregnated with mysticism. It was Grimshaw sublimated. I saw it myself, although at that time I had not heard Warham's story. The French critics saw it. This Pilleux is as picturesque as the English poet Grimshaw. The style is identical. Warham saw it. He read everything that Pilleux wrote with eagerness, with terror. Finally, driven by curiosity, he went to Paris, got Pilleux's address from the editor of Gil Blas, and started for Africa. Grimshaw is a misty figure at the last. You see him faintly, an exile, racially featureless, wearing a dirty white native robe, his face wrinkled by exposure to the sun, his eyes burning. Marie says that he prowled about the village at night, whispering to himself, his head thrown back, pointing his beard at the stars. He wrote in the cool hours before dawn, and later, when the village quivered in heat fumes and he slept, Marie posted what he had written to Paris. One day he took her head between his hands and said very gently, "Why don't you get a lover? Take life while you can." "You say there is eternal life," she protested. "N'en doutez pas, but you must be rich in knowledge. Put flowers in your hair and place your palms against a lover's palms and kiss him with generosity, ma petite. I am not a man. I'm a shadow. Mary slipped her arms around him and, standing on tiptoe, put her lips against his. Je t'aime, she said simply. His eyes deepened. There flashed into them the old mad humor, the old vitality, the old passion for beauty. The look faded, leaving his eyes like flames that are quenched. Mary shivered, covered her face with her hands, and ran out. There was no blood in him, she told me. He was like a spirit, a ghost, so meager, so wan, waxen hands, yellow flesh, and those eyes in which, monsieur, the flame was quenched. And this is the end of the curious story. Warham went to Biskra, and from there to the village where Grimshaw lived. Grimshaw saw him in the street one evening and followed him to the hotel. He lingered outside until Warham had registered at the bureau and had gone to his room. Then he went in and sent word that P.P.L.O. was below and ready to see Dr. Warham. He waited in the garden at the back of the hotel. No one was about. A cat slept on the wall. Overhead, the arch of the sky was flooded with orange light. Dust lay on the leaves of the potted plants and bushes. It was breathless, hot, quiet. He thought, Warham has come because Dagmar is dead, or the public has found me out. Warham came immediately. He stood in the doorway a moment, staring at the grotesque figure which faced him. He made a terrified gesture, as if he would shut out what he saw. Then he came into the garden, steadying himself by holding on to the backs of the little iron garden chairs. The poet saw that Warham had not changed so very much. A little grey hair in that thick black mop, a few wrinkles, a rather stodgy look about the waist, no more. He was still Warham, neat, self-satisfied, essentially English. Grimshaw strangled a feeling of aversion and said quietly, Well, Warham, how do you do? I call myself Pellew now. Warham ignored his hand. Leaning heavily on one of the chairs, he stared with a passionate intentness. Grimshaw, he said at last. Why, yes, Grimshaw answered. Didn't you know? Warham licked his lips. In a whisper, he said, I killed you in Switzerland 6 years ago. Killed you, you understand? Grimshaw touched his breast with both hands. You lie. Here I am. You are dead. Dead? Before God, I swear it. Dead? Grimshaw felt once more the onrushing flood of darkness. His thoughts flashed back over the years. The war, his suffering, the dog, the song in the field, the Negro, the door that opened, the stars, his own flesh fading into spirit, into shadows. Dead? He demanded again. Warham's eyes wavered. He laughed unsteadily and looked behind him. Strange, he said. I thought I saw. He turned and went quickly across the garden into the hotel. Grimshaw called once in a loud voice, Warham! But the doctor did not even turn his head. Grimshaw followed him, overtook him, touched his shoulder. Warham paid no attention. Going to the bureau, he said to the proprietor, You told me that a Monsieur Pellew wished to see me. Oui, monsieur, he was waiting for you in the garden. He's not there now. But just a moment ago. I'm here, Grimshaw interrupted. Dr. Warham straightened his shoulders. Ah, he said, disappeared. Exactly. And passing Grimshaw without a glance, he went upstairs. Grimshaw spoke to the proprietor. But the little man bent over the desk and began to write in an account book. His pen went on scratching, inscribing large, flourishing numbers in a neat column. Grimshaw shrugged and went into the road. The crowds paid no attention to him, but then they never had. A dog sniffed at his heels. whined, and thrust a cold nose into his hand. He went to his house. I'll ask Mary, he thought. She was sitting before a mirror, her hands clasped under her chin, smiling at herself. She had put a flower in her hair. Her lips were parted. She smiled at some secret thought. Grimshaw watched her a moment. Then, with a leap of his heart, he touched her shoulder, and she did not turn, did not move. He knew. He put his fingers on her cheek, her neck, the shining braids of her coarse black hair. Then he walked quickly out of the house, out of the village, toward the desert. Two men joined him. One of them said, I have just died. They went on together, their feet whispering in the sand, walking in a globe of darkness until the stars came out. Then they saw one another's pale faces and eager, frightened eyes. Others joined them, and others, men, women, a child. Some wept, and some murmured, and some laughed. Is this death? Where now, brother? Grimshaw thought. The end. What next? Beauty? Love? Illusion?